Are Prisons Obsolete? Written by Angela Y. Davis, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Chapter 4. How Gender Structures the Prison System. Quote, I've been told that I will never leave prison if I continue to fight the system. My answer is that one must be alive in order to leave prison, and our current standard of medical care is tantamount to a death sentence. Therefore, I have no choice but to continue. Conditions within the institution continually re-invoke memories of violence and oppression, often with devastating results. Unlike other incarcerated women who have come forward to reveal their impressions of prison, I do not feel safer here because the abuse has stopped, quote-unquote. It has not stopped. It has shifted shape and paced itself differently, but it is as insidious and pervasive in prison as ever it was in the world I know outside of these walls. What has ceased is my ignorance of the facts concerning abuse and my willingness to tolerate it in silence. End quote. Marcia Bunny. Over the last 5 years, the prison system has received far more attention by the media than at any time since the period following the 1971 Attica Rebellion. However, with a few important exceptions, women have been left out of the public discussions about the expansion of the U.S. prison system. I am not suggesting that simply bringing women into the existing conversations on jails and prisons will deepen our analysis of state punishment and further the project of prison abolition. Addressing issues that are specific to women's prisons is of vital importance, but it is equally important to shift the way we think about the prison system as a whole. Certainly, women's prison practices are gendered, but so too are men's prison practices. To assume that men's institutions constitute the norm and women's institutions are marginal is, in a sense, to participate in the very normalization of prisons that an abolitionist approach seeks to contest. Thus, the title of this chapter is not Women and the Prison System, but rather How Gender Structures the Prison System. Moreover, scholars and activists who are involved in feminist projects should not consider the structure of state punishment as marginal to their work. Forward-looking research and organizing strategies should recognize that the deeply gendered character of punishment both reflects and further entrenches the gendered structure of the larger society. Women prisoners have produced a small but impressive body of literature that has illuminated significant aspects of the organization of punishment that would have otherwise remained unacknowledged. Assata Shakur's memoirs, for example, reveal the dangerous intersections of racism, male domination, and state strategies of political repression. In 1977, she was convicted on charges of murder and assault in connection with a 1973 incident that left one New Jersey state trooper dead and another wounded. She and her companion, Zaid Shakur, who was killed during the shootout, were the targets of what we now name racial profiling and were stopped by state troopers under the pretext of a broken tail light. At the time, Assata Shakur, known then as Joanne Chesimard, was underground and had been anointed by the police and the media as the soul of the Black Liberation Army. By her 1977 conviction, she either had been acquitted of or had charges dismissed in 6 other cases, upon the basis of which she had been declared a fugitive in the first place. Her attorney, Lennox Hines, has pointed out that since it was proven that Assata Shakur did not handle the gun with which the state troopers were shot, her mere presence in the automobile against the backdrop of the media demonization to which she was subjected constituted the basis of her conviction. In the foreword to Shakur's autobiography, Hines writes, "In the history of New Jersey, no woman pre-trial detainee or prisoner has ever been treated as she was, continuously confined in a men's prison under 24-hour surveillance of her most intimate functions without intellectual sustenance, adequate medical attention and exercise, and without the company of other women for all the years that she was in their custody. There is no doubt that Assata Shakur's status as a black political prisoner accused of killing a state trooper caused her to be singled out by the authorities for unusually cruel treatment. However, her own account emphasizes the extent to which her individual experiences reflected those of other imprisoned women, especially black and Puerto Rican women. Her description of the strip search, which focuses on the internal examination of body cavities, is especially revealing. Joan Bird and Afeni Shakur, members of the Black Panther Party, had told me about it after they had been bailed out in the Panther 21 trial. When they had told me, I was horrified. "You mean they really put their hands inside you to search you?" I had asked. "Uh-huh," they answered. "Every woman who has ever been on the Rock or in the old house of detention can tell you about it. The women call it getting the finger, or, more vulgarly, getting finger-fucked." "What happens if you refuse?" I had asked Afeni. "They lock you in the hole and they don't let you out until you consent to be searched internally." I thought about refusing, but I sure as hell didn't want to be in the hole. I had had enough of solitary. The quote-unquote internal search was as humiliating and disgusting as it sounded. You sit on the edge of this table and the nurse holds your legs open and sticks a finger in your vagina and moves it around. She has a plastic glove on. Some of them try to put one finger in your vagina and another one up your rectum at the same time. I have quoted this passage so extensively because it exposes an everyday routine in women's prisons that verges on sexual assault as much as it is taken for granted. Having been imprisoned in the women's house of detention to which Joan Bird and Afeni Shakur refer, I can personally affirm the veracity of their claims. Over 30 years after Bird and Afeni Shakur were released and after I myself spent several months in the women's house of detention, this issue of the strip search is still very much on the front burner of women's prison activism. In 2001, Sisters Inside, an Australian support organization for women prisoners, launched a national campaign against the strip search, the slogan of which was, "Stop State Sexual Assault." Assata Shakur's autobiography provides an abundance of insights about the gendering of state punishment, and reveals the extent to which women's prisons have held on to oppressive patriarchal practices that are considered obsolete in the quote-unquote free world. She spent 6 years in several jails and prisons before escaping in 1979 and receiving political asylum by the Republic of Cuba in 1984, where she lives today. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wrote an earlier account of life in a women's prison, The Alderson Story, My Life as a Political Prisoner. At the height of the McCarthy era, Flynn, a labor activist and communist leader, was convicted under the Smith Act and served 2 years in Alderson Federal Reformatory for Women, from 1955 to 1957. Following the dominant model for women's prisons during that period, Alderson's regimes were based on the assumption that, quote-unquote, criminal women could be rehabilitated by assimilating correct, womanly behaviors, that is, by becoming experts in domesticity, especially cooking, cleaning, and sewing. Of course, training designed to produce better wives and mothers among middle-class white women effectively produced skilled domestic servants among black and poor women. Flynn's book provides vivid descriptions of these everyday regimes. Her autobiography is located in a tradition of prison writing by political prisoners that also includes women of this era. Contemporary writings by women political prisoners today include poems and short stories by Erica Huggins and Susan Rosenberg, analyses of the prison industrial complex by Linda Evans, and curricula for HIV/AIDS education in women's prisons by Kathy Boudin and the members of the Bedford Hills ACE Collective. Despite the availability of perceptive portrayals of life in women's prisons, it has been extremely difficult to persuade the public, and even on occasion to persuade prison activists who are primarily concerned with the plight of male prisoners, of the centrality of gender to an understanding of state punishment. Although men constitute the vast majority of prisoners in the world, important aspects of the operation of state punishment are missed if it is assumed that women are marginal and thus undeserving of attention. The most frequent justification for the inattention to women prisoners and to the particular issues surrounding women's imprisonment is the relatively small proportion of women among incarcerated populations throughout the world. In most countries, the percentage of women among prison populations hovers around 5%. However, the economic and political shifts of the 1980s, the globalization of economic markets, the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, the dismantling of such social service programs as aid to families of dependent children, and of course, the prison construction boom produced a significant acceleration in the rate of women's imprisonment, both inside and outside the United States. In fact, women remain today the fastest growing sector of the U.S. prison population. This recent rise in the rate of women's imprisonment points directly to the economic context that produced the prison industrial complex and has had a devastating impact on men and women alike. It is from this perspective of the contemporary expansion of prisons, both in the United States and throughout the world, that we should examine some of the historical and ideological aspects of state punishment imposed on women. Since the end of the 18th century when, as we have seen, imprisonment began to emerge as the dominant form of punishment, convicted women have been represented as essentially different from their male counterparts. It is true that men who commit the kinds of transgressions that are regarded as punishable by the state are labeled as social deviants. Nevertheless, masculine criminality has always been deemed more quote-unquote normal than feminine criminality. There has always been a tendency to regard those women who have been publicly punished by the state for their misbehaviors as significantly more aberrant and far more threatening to society than their numerous male counterparts. In seeking to understand this gendered difference in the perception of prisoners, it should be kept in mind that as the prison emerged and evolved as the major form of public punishment, women continued to be routinely subjected to forms of punishment that have not been acknowledged as such. For example, women have been incarcerated in psychiatric institutions in greater proportion than in prisons. Studies indicating that women have been even more likely to end up in mental facilities than men suggest that while jails and prisons have been dominant institutions for the control of men, mental institutions have served a similar purpose for women. That is, deviant men have been constructed as criminal, while deviant women have been constructed as insane. Regimes that reflect this assumption continue to inform the women's prison. Psychiatric drugs continue to be distributed far more extensively to imprisoned women than to their male counterparts. A Native American woman incarcerated in the Women's Correctional Center in Montana related her experience with psychotropic drugs to sociologist Luana Ross. Haldol is a drug they give people who can't cope with lockup. It makes you feel dead, paralyzed. And then I started getting side effects from Haldol. I wanted to fight anybody, any of the officers. I was screaming at them and telling them to get out of my face. So the doctor said, "We can't have that." And they put me on Transine. I don't take pills. I never had trouble sleeping until I got here. Now I'm supposed to see the counselor again because of my dreams. If you've got a problem, they're not going to take care of it. They're going to put you on drugs so that they can control you." Unquote. Prior to the emergence of the penitentiary and thus of the notion of punishment as doing time, the use of confinement to control beggars, thieves, and the insane did not necessarily distinguish among these categories of deviancy. At this phase in the history of punishment, prior to the American and French revolutions, the classification process through which criminality is differentiated from poverty and mental illness had not yet developed. As the discourse on criminality and the corresponding institutions to control it distinguished the criminal from the insane, the gendered distinction took hold and continued to structure penal policies. Gendered as female, this category of insanity was highly sexualized. When we consider the impact of class and race here, we can say that for white and affluent women, this equalization tends to serve as evidence for emotional and mental disorder, but for black and poor women, it has pointed to criminality. It should also be kept in mind that until the abolition of slavery, the vast majority of black women were subject to regimes of punishment that differed significantly from those experienced by white women. As slaves, they were directly and often brutally disciplined for conduct considered perfectly normal in a context of freedom. Slave punishment was visibly gendered. Special penalties were, for example, reserved for pregnant women unable to reach the quotas that determined how long and how fast they should work. In the slave narratives of Moses Grandy, an especially brutal form of whipping is described in which the woman was required to lie on the ground with her stomach positioned in a hole, whose purpose was to safeguard the fetus, conceived of as future slave labor. If we expand our definition of punishment under slavery, then we can say that the coerced sexual relations between slave and master constituted a penalty exacted on women, if only for the sole reason that they were slaves. In other words, the deviance of the slave master was transferred to the slave woman, whom he victimized. Likewise, sexual abuse by prison guards is translated into hypersexuality of women prisoners. The notion that female deviance always has a sexual dimension persists in the contemporary era, and this intersection of criminality and sexuality continues to be racialized. Thus, white women labeled as criminals are more closely associated with blackness than their quote-unquote normal counterparts. Prior to the emergence of the prison as the major form of public punishment, it was taken for granted that violators of the law would be subjected to corporal and frequently capital penalties. What is not generally recognized is the connection between state-inflicted corporal punishment and the physical assaults on women in domestic spaces. This form of bodily discipline has continued to be routinely meted out to women in the context of intimate relationships, but it is rarely understood to be related to state punishment. Quaker reformers in the United States, especially the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, founded in 1987, played a pivotal role in campaigns to substitute imprisonment for corporal punishment. Following in the tradition established by Elizabeth Fry in England, Quakers were also responsible for extended crusades to institute separate prisons for women. Given the practice of incarcerating criminalized women in men's prisons, the demand for separate women's prisons was viewed as quite radical during this period. Fry formulated principles governing prison reforms for women in her 1827 work, Observations in Visiting, Superintendence and Government of Female Prisoners, which was taken up in the United States by women such as Josephine Shaw Lowell and Abby Hopper Gibbons. In the 1870s, Lowell and Gibbons helped to lead the campaign in New York for separate prisons for women. Prevailing attitudes towards women convicts differed from those towards men convicts, who were assumed to have forfeited rights and liberties that women generally could not claim, even in the quote-unquote free world. Although some women were housed in penitentiaries, the institution itself was gendered as male, for by and large no particular arrangements were made to accommodate sentenced women. The women who served in penal institutions between 1820 and 1870 were not subject to the prison reform experienced by male inmates. Officials employed isolation, silence, and hard labor to rehabilitate male prisoners. The lack of accommodations for female inmates made isolation and silence impossible for them, and productive labor was not considered an important part of their routine. The neglect of female prisoners, however, was rarely benevolent. Rather, a pattern of overcrowding, harsh treatment, and sexual abuse recurred throughout prison histories. Male punishment was linked ideologically to penitence and reform. The very forfeiture of rights and liberties implied that with self-reflection, religious study, and work, male convicts could achieve redemption and could recover these rights and liberties. However, since women were not acknowledged as securely in possession of these rights, they were not eligible to participate in this process of redemption. According to dominant views, women convicts were irrevocably fallen women with no possibility of salvation. If male criminals were considered to be public individuals who had simply violated the social contract, female criminals were seen as having transgressed fundamental moral principles of womanhood. The reformers who, following Elizabeth Fry, argued that women were capable of redemption did not really contest these ideological assumptions about women's place. In other words, they did not question the very notion of fallen women. Rather, they simply opposed the idea that fallen women could not be saved. They could be saved, the reformers contended, and towards that end, they advocated for separate penal facilities and a specifically female approach to punishment. Their approach called for architectural models that replaced cells with cottages and quote-unquote rooms in a way that was supposed to infuse domesticity into prison life. This model facilitated a regime devised to reintegrate criminalized women into the domestic life of wife and mother. They did not, however, acknowledge the class and race underpinnings of this regime. Training that was, on the surface, designed to produce good wives and mothers, in effect steered poor women, and especially black women, into quote-unquote free world jobs in domestic service. Instead of stay-at-home skilled wives and mothers, many women prisoners upon release would become maids, cook, or washerwomen for more affluent women. A female custodial staff, the reformers also argued, would minimize the sexual temptations, which they believed were often at the root of female criminality. When the reform movement calling for separate prisons for women emerged in England and the United States during the 19th century, Elizabeth Fry, Josephine Shaw, and other advocates argued against the established idea that criminal women were beyond the reach of moral rehabilitation. Like male convicts who presumably could be corrected by rigorous prison regimes, female convicts, they suggested, could also be molded into moral beings by differently gendered imprisonment regimes. Architectural changes, domestic regimes, and an all-female custodial staff were implemented in the reformatory program proposed by the reformers, and eventually women's prisons became as strongly anchored to the social landscape as men's prisons, but even more invisible. Their greater invisibility was as much a reflection of the way women's domestic duties under patriarchy were assumed to be normal, natural, and consequently invisible as it was of the relatively small numbers of women incarcerated in these new institutions. 21 years after the first English reformatory for women was established in London in 1853, the first U.S. reformatory for women, was opened in Indiana. The aim was to, quote, train the prisoners in the important female role of domesticity. Thus, an important role of the reform movement in women's prisons was to encourage and ingrain, quote-unquote, appropriate gender roles, such as vocational training in cooking, sewing, and cleaning. To accommodate these goals, the reformatory cottages were usually designed with kitchens, living rooms, and even some nurseries for prisoners with infants. However, this feminized public punishment did not affect all women in the same way. When Black and Native American women were imprisoned in reformatories, they often were segregated from white women. Moreover, they tended to be disproportionately sentenced to men's prisons. In the southern states, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Black women endured the cruelties of the convict lease system, unmitigated by the feminization of punishment. Neither their sentences nor the labor they were compelled to do were lessened by virtue of their gender. As the U.S. prison system evolved during the 20th century, feminized modes of punishment, the cottage system, domestic training, and so on, were designed ideologically to reform white women, relegating women of color in large part to realms of public punishment that made no pretense of offering them femininity. Moreover, as Lucia Zedner has pointed out, sentencing practices for women within the reformatory system often required women of all racial backgrounds to do more time than men for similar offenses. This differential was justified on the basis that women were sent to reformatories not to be punished in proportion to the seriousness of their offense, but to be reformed and retrained, a process that, it was argued, required time. At the same time, Zedner points out this tendency to send women to prison for longer terms than men was accelerated by the eugenics movement, which sought to have genetically inferior women removed from social circulation for as many of their childbearing years as possible. At the beginning of the 21st century, women's prisons have begun to look more like their male counterparts, particularly facilities constructed in the contemporary era of the prison industrial complex. As corporate involvement in punishment expands in ways that would have been unimaginable just 2 decades ago, the prison's presumed goal of rehabilitation has been thoroughly displaced by incapacitation as the major objective of imprisonment. As I have already pointed out, now that the population of U.S. prisons and jails has surpassed 2 million people, the rate of increase in the numbers of women prisoners has exceeded that of men. As criminologist Elliot Curry has pointed out, quote, for most of the period after World War II, the female incarceration rate hovered at around 8 per 100,000. It did not reach double digits until 1977. Today, it is 51 per 100,000. At the current rates of increase, there will be more women in American prisons in the year 2010 than there were inmates of both sexes in 1970. When we combine the effects of race and gender, the nature of these shifts in the prison population is even clearer. The prison incarceration rate for Black women today exceeds that for white men as recently as 1980. Luana Ross's study of Native American women incarcerated in the Women's Correctional Center in Montana argues that, quote, prisons as employed by the Euro-American system operate to keep Native Americans in a colonial situation, unquote. She points out that Native people are vastly overrepresented in the country's federal and state prisons. In Montana, where she did her research, they constitute 6% of the general population, but 17.3% of the imprisoned population. Native women are even more disproportionately present in Montana's prison system. They constitute 25% of all women imprisoned by the state. This has been Are Prisons Obsolete? Written by Angela Davis, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Chapter 4, How Gender Structures the Prison System, Part 1.